Hello people, and welcome back to part 25 of the Noobs Guide to City Skylines. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Thanks so much for your support last week when we built our little, well not little, actually quite enormous ore quarry. Of course using the all stuff from the Industries DLC and really unique areas to put together. I think lots of terraforming and use of the larger, slightly more bolder rock assets that we rarely get to use in City Skylines in appropriate places at least. An inclusion of some office zoning, some cargo rail, and the appropriate placements of some of the unique factories. It all tied in really nicely to create a really fun, functioning, good traffic spewing ore area. So really happy with it and thank you for all the support on it. However, today we are going to be working with the last of the park life areas. We're going to be making the dedicated nature reserve over on this hill. That's been sat in this side of the suburb for a while now. So we're not going to do a typical nature reserve today, not what one you'd think in terms of like Zion National Park or Yellowstone or Yosemite. Nothing of that scale and size, of course, because we are within the 9 tiles. But what I'd like to try and do is repurpose some of the nature reserve assets almost into something of a small holiday park, and having a look at how we can think slightly more outside of the box with some of the assets that we have to play with in City Skylines. So we've got some nice ideas in store today, quite a cute, unique space to work with as well, with some terraforming opportunities as well, of course, just to try and make this nature reserve look a little bit more nature reservy, so to speak. And of course, it will hold a wonderful view to that eventual nighttime skyline in Noveria, which is becoming more and more appreciated each week now, isn't it? Otherwise, let's have a look at how we can work with the nature reserve assets a little more creatively in City Skylines, shall we? Okay, so we're going to start today's episode just by doing a touch of terraforming. Just because we're working, of course, with a uneven landmass today, it's always nice just to prepare some initial spaces, and then, of course, we can design something around it to fit the theme once we have our asset placed. So we're going to come into the parks and plazas. Now, for those that have been following along with this series, you will know that we actually already have a nature reserve within the city, but it's not really functioning as a nature reserve. It is just the beach walkway. We used a nature reserve gate, but it's quite clearly a tourist beachfront instead of a nature reserve. However, what this has done for us is actually unlocked a bunch of the assets. So we actually have Hillside Meadows, which has had 34,000 visitors a week and is waiting to hit level 4 due to its entertainment threshold. So this should be really easy for us to put together sort of a proper nature reserve in the build today. So we've got a few, or a full. Yes, we have a full cemetery, that's fine. We'll clear that up in a second. And there's also a bit of a death wave happening in the hillside suburb as well, but that'll get cleared up. So let's go ahead and place down the nature reserve main gate, I think is the one I'm going to go for. Again, really nice looking building, has National Park on the front of it, which is quite cool. Then we're going to come into our slope terrain tools, and I'm going to grab the top height of the hill here. And then from this point, I'm just going to start meandering, sort of in a snaky pattern, up this hillside until we eventually reach that point, carving out a little groove for our path to sit against, okay? And then once we're there, we can perhaps have a look at setting up something of like a visitor centre or something of an arrival point for all the Sims that are coming here today. There's a few different ideas we can take the nature reserve in. You know, don't sort of get stuck into the mindset of thinking that these things have to be these enormous expanses of nature sort of in valleys and, you know, like the national parks you mentioned at the start, sort of the Zions and the Yosemites and the Yellowstones. They don't always have to be that grand a scale, okay? So just preparing a little bit of slope tool, we can create a nice little meandering pathway at the top, which again is going to be slightly more interesting for our path networks. And then again, a little bit of soften all the way around the edges of your new terrain work will just help everything settle in a little bit more, okay? There we go, fantastic. So what I'd like to talk about now is what we just mentioned, sort of an arrivals centre, somewhere where you can maybe stop and get a coffee once you've arrived, or perhaps where you can pick up your keys for your cabin that you're staying in while you're on holiday, you know, something along those lines. So I'd like this ideally to be snapped into the grid that is behaving with the road network. So we're going to come onto road length angle and grid for that. And then I'm just going to draw up a base frame. I'm going to also use zoo path without decoration, so it's a little bit more sort of official. And now I know that I'm on the axis, this is okay. Let's have a look where we want to start drawing from. This seems like a sort of top central point, so let's go from this one here. So like a visitor centre, I'm thinking that will actually mix and match a few of the zoo assets within this space today, because they are slightly nature reserve looking, and the nature reserve doesn't come with like cafes and sort of souvenir shops and stuff, which we can repurpose into, you know, the visitor's arrival center, if you like. So I think I'm actually going to start with a plaza, and then we'll kind of focus everything around this plaza as where you can pick up the keys for your cabin, or maybe you're going bouldering in this little park here today and you need to pick up some safety equipment, then you can grab that here as well. Maybe like it's for hire. Whatever justifications you need, you can bring in. Let's go ahead and grab our nature reserve fence again, or nature reserve pathway, and then we'll just get a nice curve tool here on the road guideline and then get a connection in. That's going to be okay for me. Back into the zoo assets now. We can just repurpose basically the zoo cafe is a great one. Let's have this one in there. We'll also have the zoo souvenir shop perhaps a couple of times, almost fused together, if you will, with what we can in the vanilla game. And then perhaps a zoo restroom on the side. Alright, and then we can maybe squeeze in. I wonder if one of the park life ones would be totally out of question here. Yeah, it's too much concrete and modern, isn't it? Yeah, I think it is. Okay, and then on second thought, having seen the zoo plaza now, I think we're going to delete this, and what we'll do is during our detailing time lapse is come through with a lot of our part props, such as the smaller sort of rundown looking benches, right? Sort of design our own little central plaza space, perhaps a couple of scattered tables with one of our larger trees in, maybe like a live oak or two in the right place, with some carefully placed bins in here too, okay? And maybe a touch of bird bath as well. So we can just create our own little plaza at the front of these sort of arrival and check-in shops. Okay, it's a little more subtle than the zoo plaza, isn't it, I think? Sort of a little custom one with part props and whatnot. So I'm happy with that, that's cool. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is just have a little talk about how we can repurpose some of the assets into a little bit more of a creative theme. So we have the hunting cabins in the nature reserve, so what I'm going to do is dig them out just a little cliff face for them to sit against, okay? I want a little bit of that vanilla brown cliff face exposed at the back of the terraforming job here. And then also a little bit of it just towards the ridge line as well. Not too harsh though, don't fully terraform it against your existing frames. And then I'm looking for a stretch of nature reserve fence. I'm going to snap this to a road guideline, just so we know that we're straight. Then we can have that there. Perhaps a touch further out this way as well. Let's dive into the world of nature reserve. I'm going to grab hunting cabins number 2. There is also number 1 variant, but number 2 is slightly bigger and more important. I'm going to place this here, okay? Which I think is quite nice just on its own. It's going to hold, quite a nice view if you're coming here to stay here for the weekend. Perhaps enjoy a little bit of bouldering or some walks around, the local woods on the mountains. Then you can also enjoy a view of Noob Oak from your little mountainside cabin as well. But there's something further interesting we can do with this as well. Rather than placing it directly against the pathway here as it snaps in, let's just give it a little bit of breathing room, perhaps to about there. Of course, it's still going to register its connection, which is great, that's what we want. Then let's dive into the world of those tiles that we can see, which are the nature reserve tiles. And then what we can do now with our detailing in the vanilla game is just expand these smaller little spaces out. Perhaps they brought a couple of tables and whatnot. There might be another little well out here. And then granted, whilst you're relatively sort of limited with the vanilla game props, you can still be somewhat creative. Perhaps a little sign outside of each one which just sort of names the cabin as people are walking along, trying to find the one that they've booked. You can be a little bit more creative in that sense. Maybe grab one of the little public binoculars out here as well, with again a couple of those sort of older looking bench props either side, and then perhaps a little delicate nuance of nature reserve fencing that kind of sits within the boundary of the cabin itself. Okay, and then once combined with perhaps some little bushes around the edge of it here, let's also move those binoculars forward just a little bit, but you can kind of get the impression here, okay? You can be creative within the limitations of the vanilla game sometimes. Let's definitely get some of the trees in here too. Give it some content creator action. Okay, we'll also give, a good healthy dose of Noobs Guide Forest to this area as well. Okay, but before you know it, just piecing together a little bit of a fort entrance in front of the cabins. Extends it into more like a little holiday retreat resort as opposed to an actual hunting cabin that you would find relatively isolated in the middle of the woods. They also come with barbecues on them as well, so it's a little more sort of holiday themed. You can get on board with that idea, okay? So this is what we'll do here. We'll place in some cabins, so let's time lapse up some cabin developments, and then we'll see what we can do with this sort of frontage space here, and connect it in with the main plaza and see what we think. So we'll be right back. And we can get a general impression of how this detailing looks now, right? Some multiple layers of different cabins with some fencing and different patterns of, albeit the very limited vanilla nature reserve props that we get, unfortunately. If you ever find it, you can find some of the sort of grills and other looking sort of nature reserve things with the Find It mod, but without that, you're kind of stuck. But I think it's okay, right? We can pretend we can be a little bit more creative here. And already now we have sort of a holiday cabin area designed for our nature reserve park, so I'm happy with that for the time being. What I would like to do now is grab ourselves another branch of nature reserve pathway and help create some tents and some camping areas for our sims here. So I'm going to bring off a nature reserve without decoration. We're going to start spamming off a few little holding frames here so we can do some different ideas and things. So the nature reserve stuff does come with a preset tent camping site number 1, which you can use if you like. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a collection of the tent assets in a single ploppable building with an entertainment value of 50. It does, however, come pre-detailed with vanilla bushes and awful vanilla palms, so that's a swift no thank you from me. I much prefer to craft my own camping sites. So again, these are just going to want a path connection, and we can cluster them around sort of little nuances of detail again, right? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and pick out a specific place here? Let's go for this one right here, okay? We're slightly on an elevation here, but that should be okay. Go ahead and make a really small little path roundabout at a cost of 60 per measurement, which is 2 tiles. And then we can grab ourselves perhaps campfire number 1. Actually, probably the lean-to fire might be more appropriate here. Yeah, okay, so we'll place in the big fireplace itself, all right, in the middle. This will, of course, have a fire on it as well eventually from the aesthetic point of view. And then we can manually place in our tents around the side now. In different fashions, you can get them closer if you like, or further apart. It depends all sort of what vibe you want to go for. Side note as well, if you're also looking to do some downtown detailing, these tents will snap to a road, so you can perhaps generate some sort of homeless district. That's something that we've done especially in Noveria before for long-time watchers. Okay, then of course you can now bring in your own trees, especially like the content creator palms. Perhaps there is like a coconut tree here, and people staying occasionally find the old coconut, and it sort of, they have coconut milk. I don't really know where I was going with that story, but you can customize it to your own desire rather than just sort of accepting the fact that this is a preset tent camping site and then just drop it in there like that. I think I prefer to customize my own, and of course this is just one variation and shape of this. You can do many different other shapes and designs, of course. So entirely up to you as to which ones you want to use. Don't be afraid. And then again, whilst we have a viewpoint here, why don't we try and respect that again? What we'll do is just amend our little terraform landmass. Because bearing in mind, this was initially kind of a natural peak within the mountains of Diamond Coast. Why don't we have in a little viewing platform here, which of course is going to want its own little connection. So we'll just throw that in there. And then where we do have this now, we can just soften everyone out, of course, and maybe a touch of slope terrain is actually required here to help blend this in a little bit. There we go. See if we can sort it out. And then little bits of soften off of the back of that. There we go. Helps it settle in a little bit easier, doesn't it? But again, we can respect the views to the rest of the city with one of these little viewing platforms here. Quite special, isn't it? Especially at night time as well, you imagine. Sort of looking out over all of Noobs, essentially, apart from the industrial areas over in the south of the city. So once we have these path networks established within the build, I'm just going to go ahead and prepare another little camping site pathway off there. We'll do that in our detail and time lapse. But then we can just start to piece together these areas and create these little spaces now, which are perfect for the essential overcharged egg detailing, right? This is the old faithful rock garden, or the nature reserve fence box, whatever you want to call it. There's all endless variations, of course, if you've been following Palaven or Noveria, or indeed the ones that we've come up with in Noobs Guide as well. They all work here. Let's go ahead and get some thick vegetation in there as well, okay? Let's please look at that. There we go, really envelop those rocks within it. Some of the content creator long grasses are going to be really helpful here, and this is all just natural, sort of rural, overgrown detailing. One of my biggest satisfactions within the game. Let's get some of these wild hedges around it, and especially now we've got the content creator trees as well. Just made an enormous difference to all of this sort of stuff that we love so much and so dearly. Okay, just got some pines in there too, a couple of cottonwoods, and maybe a couple of California shorties, and then you can just introduce these little nuances of nature that are now within the nature reserve itself and have been sort of cordoned off to protect them from being sort of trampled on as people enjoy sort of camping out over in the wild. Okay, so just another little example of ideas that we can pick up using some tents and different patterns rather than just accepting the sort of preset asset like the tent campsite number 1. Make your own, you know, you can do some interesting things with them. And then introduce in your own detailing palettes around the nature reserve as well. We'll help everyone settle in a little bit more, okay? So I'm happy with that. Okay, so there's some people starting to move around the park now, which I'm happy with. So I'd like to discuss sort of the final dedicated area that we're going to do for the nature reserve, and then we can have a look at a detail and time lapse and some other little nuances using the assets. So we unlock something at level 5, which is called the bouldering site, again, which I have unlocked from the level 5 hillside meadows over on the beach now. Okay, so if you've followed along with Noobs Guide, then you would have already built a nature reserve for this. If not, then it's just exactly the same as all the other park life areas, like the city park and the zoo and the amusement park. Hit the entertainment value and the visitor threshold when you'll hit the next level. You know, we know how to use park life at this point. Cool, so let's go ahead and grab the bouldering site. We'll have a little look at it. So it is just 2 boulders, alright? And eventually, once the asset kicks in, there we go, the bouldering people will start to climb it, okay? So really cool looking asset, and again, for those that followed my first venture in 5B, will know exactly kind of the point that we're going to do here today in order to give assets that are in the theme a little bit more of that theme. So I've placed some rocky outcrops here, and the cliff over this side of the reserve is at its sort of steepest. So I'm going to respect that. So I'm going to do a little bit of level terrain and carve out a huge chunk of land that I want to use, because again, we're going to be playing with themes here. So let's go ahead and drop in a couple of these bouldering sites, okay? And we'll place them sort of clustered around fairly close together. We can overlap them by quite a distance, the bouldering sites, even without the anarchy mods, which is quite helpful. Okay, so I think I'm happy with that concept for right now. Let's then come back into some of our larger rock assets, and we definitely want to grab the cliffs, sort of 10 through 12, I think, yes. Okay, and then I'm just looking to create little false cliff faces on this side, okay? And then perhaps maybe we won't get the cliff in there, that's too big, isn't it? This one's possibly also too large, but we can just jiggle it around until we get a sweet spot. Okay, so I'm really looking to blend the vanilla rock assets in with the bouldering sites to give the impression that these boulders over the years have fallen down and have now become recreational space for the more adrenaline addicted among us. Okay, so there we go. Much more purpose for the bouldering sites now. Of course, let's grab some nature reserve pathway with decorations, and then we'll give these guys a connection. Then we can meander this up. Then we're going to have it hug the cliff face here as well. And then again, we'll come back to the road guideline. And then we can generate that curve in there as well. Okay, so really simple, really easy way of piecing together some bouldering sites rather than just grabbing them and sticking them along a fence or along a pathway, sorry, in a nature reserve, and then just leaving it as that. So much more interesting, right, when it's on its own little area that has purpose and themes to it. And this is a little bouldering site now, in my opinion. That's pretty cute, right? And of course, if you want to embellish with further assets here, perhaps like there's a little sort of mini rec area over by this way for people that aren't doing any bouldering or rock climbing and they want to just sort of maybe chill out and watch their loved ones do it, then I don't think, you know, a touch of the nature reserve panels from the DLC with a little bit of prop line tool and perhaps a couple of the campfires with, you know, some tables out here as well, kind of spread, you know, pretty sporadically around. Doesn't all have to be even and measured, you know. Imagine there's not much admin in this sort of place, so it's just kind of left for wherever the people that use it leave it, if that makes any sense. I hope that it does. Okay, a couple of signs in there as well, I think. Maybe a little well over here too. Again, it is a shame. I feel like the nature reserve props are the ones that were most neglected with this DLC, but we live and learn. And of course, find it is a massive help. Let's just bring in some nature reserve fence against that, and then we'll grab our forest brush. And then we'll just say yes, very thick Noobs Guide forest in this part, please. And then we'll wrap it around the pathway as well as it comes into this sort of the part of the nature reserve. Okay, again, further rock assets can also be used in the detailing in these areas as well. If indeed you can find places to squeeze them in appropriately, you know, please do maintain appropriate placements. Just because it's sort of natural and overgrown doesn't mean that everything that we've learned with the rules and orientations goes out the window. Pick a Noobs Guide forest in this space now, and then even just from down on the street view, we can just see that there's a little bit of personality up there now, especially if you're sat on the cycle highway. You can just see that there is like a little bouldering rock climbing site up this end, and I really like it. I think that's really cute. Okay, and of course lots more bushes and overgrowth, sort of extend the overgrowth out of the rocks around here during our detailing time lapse today, which should be quite fun. So creative use of some of the assets. Don't always have to throw them on a pathway and be done with them, you know, give them a bit of a theme. But otherwise, guys, that does feel like a good place for a detailing time-lapse. We don't have that much work to do today. This episode is going to be pretty short and sweet, but quite an effective build on top of the little mountain reserve that we have within Newbie Oak. This should be quite a splendid addition. I'm just going to carry on fleshing out the front of these cabins, again, like we've looked at already today. Continue to construct and design some other tent and camping configurations around this camping part of the mountain. Have another one come off this way perhaps, and then, you know, one off this side. Lots of fence work and indeed repeated detailing to decorate our pathways within the nature reserve, alongside fleshing out our kind of visitors arrival centre where you can come and pick up your keys for the cabin or pick up a ticket for the bouldering site, etc., whatever you want to call this kind of facility. And then lots of natural and overgrowth rock detailing as we enter the reserve. Wrap the entire thing in farm fencing or nature reserve fencing around the current existing road network, and then probably also provide a exit off of the cycle network over this side as well, just so people can get on and off here. And I might throw in a secondary gate, I might throw in one over here. We'll see, I guess. We'll just see how it turns out. Otherwise, it should be really fun, cute little detailing time lapse. This one, really simple but quite effective builds to fill a somewhat awkward mountainous space within City Skylines. So, let's detail the nature reserve, and then we'll be right back. So we have also named this the Richard Reserve after one of our wonderful Patreon subscribers, Richard. Thank you so much for all your support, mate. I really appreciate it. But otherwise, let's have a detailing review, shall we? So outside of the nature reserve gate now, we've done lots of fencing, rocks and overgrowth just to help bring in those more natural overgrown vibes. And I've also decided to go very heavy on the fencing throughout the entire complex. And this is almost an attempt to create a sense of facility, if you like, that each of the camping areas are their own dedicated areas, and rather than just bleeding from one forest to another, you kind of have to follow the pathways into different areas of the nature reserve. So I'm really happy with all the heavily super fenced in areas that we've developed throughout the park. You can get a sense of it down on the ground level here. Further within the main sort of central check-in plaza, if you like, is to what I'm going to refer to it as. We've just shattered some of the fenced angles so not everything's so heavily boxed against the pathway, with some roadie patterns and again some more nature reserve signs knocking around almost as though it's there to direct people, alongside some of the park life signs and bins as well. Also created a little cafe extended off the side of one of the zoo cafe assets, and then also brought in a little kids playground. Just so you know, imagine if you're here with the kids and, you know, obviously you can't take the kids mountain climbing, so they can sort of mess about on here for the day, that sort of vibe. Also dropped in a lookout tower, and then we have a really splendid view as we come down to the cabins for hire down along the waterfront, which have really splendid views. So, you know, imagine you'd get your key from the check-in plaza, and then you'd head up this way and, you know, sort of settle in for your holiday and enjoy the views over Noob Yoke for a couple of nights. I think really cute. Yeah, really happy with the way this came out. It's just nice, sort of slightly different, more creative way of using the nature reserve assets as opposed to making, you know, a massive nature reserve. They've also brought in another gate down at the bottom, again with plenty of fencing, the Noobs Guide forest and overgrowth. We've also lined the entire Richard Reserve with some live oaks in a repeated pattern, which I think actually gives quite a nice border to the very dense forest that now lies in that part of the town. And it's settled in really nicely into the suburb. Yes, it's a nature reserve that's kind of quite... Oh, there's a train blocking my view. There we go. You know, it's a nature reserve that's in the middle of a fairly metropolitan area. But when it's executed rightly, I think if you sort of, you know, take a step back and view it from inside the suburb somewhere, it settles in nicely, doesn't it? It just looks like overgrown forest area. And then there is another cycle exit here now, and of course there's more frames that can be built out this way. And then we have our nature reserve fence that flanks all the way around. And it just sits really nicely. It just blends into the initial sort of suburban frames that are here now. So I'm really happy with it. However, guys, that is going to do it for today. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, likes, comments and shares below really help me out. Equally much if you haven't enjoyed it, then leave me a dislike as well. And if you really enjoyed it, then there are links down to Patreon, Instant Gaming and merchandise below. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's new take on a sort of slightly different styled and alternative usage of the nature reserve assets. They don't always have to be these enormous national park spaces that you usually think of when you're thinking nature reserve. Sometimes just a dedicated little holiday park works just as well, and you can bring this process down towards the waterfront as well, because of course they do have fishing cabins in the nature reserve, which we haven't been able to use today because we have no water. But this works anyway. You can do it on the mountains and a little suburban hillscape like this down on the waterfront. It's really flexible and lots of varying patterns, and of course if you have access to Find It or indeed the Steam Workshop, then you can vastly improve the props and the detailing that you have available to you with these kinds of spaces. Please do hang around for some very brief, short cinematics. This was a really simple episode, so hopefully it's been as enjoyable as the recent ones, because pretty much every video recently has been like over an hour. So hopefully this one's a little bit shorter, but either way, I hope you enjoyed it. Please do hang around for some of those cinematics, but otherwise I will shut up and we'll leave it there. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and as always, enjoy the rest of your day.